Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker. So glad to be back with you today. Really excited for today's topic. It's all about the doobie, marijuana. So I am going to tell you just a little bit about some announcements before we get started, and I'll introduce my guests. I want to just thank everybody who's a donor to Mormon Mental Health. Can't do it without you. This podcast totally depends on the financial support of the donors. So for those of you who are making a monthly or yearly donation, I just want to thank you so much and encourage those of you who maybe haven't considered it yet to consider it, because I would love to continue this project for many years to come. So with that being said, I also have a faith transition retreat coming up. So if anybody is wanting to know more about how to deal with a mixed faith marriage, or maybe transitioning in a way that they still want to be connected with Mormonism, or have a nuanced approach to Mormonism, or parenting things of that nature. These are highly well-attended and well-reviewed events. So if you're interested in that, go to my website, natashaparker.org, for more information. All right, I think that's it. That was quick. So I've got some of my favorite people. Ricky and Larry Siegel are on the show. And I want to just give a little bit of background. So a few weeks ago, we had a fairly robust discussion on the Mormon Mental Health Association Facebook page, which is just for us providers that are part of that association, about the research on marijuana and some of the, suggestions that it could be tied to mental illness or violence, and whether, with all the legalization that's happening in medical marijuana. And of course, Utah has been right in the middle of this type of scenario of legalizing, or at least trying to have a medical use of marijuana in the state. These are issues that people are highly concerned about. And as I have come to find out through my interest in sexual science, oftentimes research is either misconstrued or not great research to begin with. And we need to be very careful about what exactly we're talking about when we're saying the research, quote unquote, says, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Larry and Ricky Siegel are both colleagues of mine in the ASECT organization, which is the sex therapy certification organization that I'm a part of. But their background is very much in substance use and treating all kinds of issues. So I'm going to allow each of them to introduce themselves, because I really value their opinions. I'm excited to see what they have to say about this article that we found. So Ricky, why don't you go first?
Okay, well, I'm always delighted to be with you any chance we can get. I love our conversations, no matter what the topic. I have, of course, as you just said, we know each other through our professional sexological circles, but both Larry and I kind of came around to sex through primarily drug and brain research. Enjoy that background as often as helpful to have a kind of a neurophysiochemical basis for understanding sexuality, as well as mood and emotion, as issues we deal with in psychotherapy. So I appreciate the rounded view that this gives us. We're able to work with folks in the addiction treatment field, as well as psychotherapy and academia, in terms of addressing our forever relationship with drugs in our environment.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'll also add to that too, that we we're in the same field from different perspectives, which I think together has been also very helpful. I used to basically study psychopharmacology, and particularly effects of alcohol on the brain when I was at the Center for Alcohol Studies, and the development of the endogenous opioid systems. And Ricky was sort of in it from the toxicology end. So as we have sort of come together and merged over the years, it kind of, we both sort of came to the middle, and that was sort of the meeting of brain, drug, sex, and all of that kind of stuff. So I really do think it's given us a great perspective on a lot of the foundational issues and understandings that relate to both drug use, abuse, dependency, and sexuality.
Wonderful. And I just want to give you both a shout out that you were both very instrumental in me helping formulate a lot of the ideas around sex addiction and, how that's incorrect terminology. And again, making sense of all the research that can be so confusing around that topic. So I'm excited for the two of you to help me with this as well. So the article that we kind of had come up in our group is one that's written by an Alex Berenson, who is a journalist. So he's not a mental health practitioner, but I guess he's been doing some research as a journalist into this topic. And it's called Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. And I guess he's coming out with a book, or maybe has come out with a book, that's called Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. And there's quite a bit of, I don't know if I want to say panic kind of mania in this article, as far as, oh my goodness, if you're using marijuana, then the risks for schizophrenia, for violence, for et cetera, is just so much higher. So I want to, first of all, maybe talk a little bit about your understanding about this link between schizophrenia in particular, because he uses the terms, I was a little bit disappointed with how he uses the terms mental illness, schizophrenia, and psychosis. And then it all kind of gets lumped into this one kind of term. And those are all three distinct different things. Right. So yeah, go for it.
Well, if I could, I definitely want to echo your sentiment. I only took a cursory glance at the article, but I would definitely agree that it has a kind of a panicky tone. In fact, I'd have to go back and check, but I'm pretty certain that Tell Your Children, that phrase, was in fact a subtitle or part of the title of the 1930s classic Reefer Madness, which, now kids or college students watch it today as a comedy, often stoned while they're watching. But I always make the point, I show it in my undergraduate classes as well, make the point to make sure they realize that this was certainly not intended to be a comedy. This was a classic propaganda piece intended to scare the bejesus out of parents, in particular, that this devil's weed was coming to their neighborhood to steal the souls of their children. Mm-hmm. That level of hysteria owes to this connection, this long-standing reputation that marijuana causes mental illness.
Right. And let's not also forget the fact what underlies most of our drug laws historically. Marijuana, no exception, is racism.
Absolutely.
So there is that undertone that really does support all of our drug laws and drug attitudes that came out of the development of all those drug laws.
In fact, most people don't realize that the very reason why we refer to the plant mostly as marijuana rather than cannabis, so that term is becoming more in vogue as medical cannabis grows across the country, no pun intended. But the use of the word marijuana, the Spanish term, particularly the Mexican term for cannabis, was very intentional. Most of this is all from the Reefer Madness days, is the work of one guy, a guy named Harry Anslinger, who was the original, what we now would know of as a drug czar. From the 30s until the 60s, US drug policy was pretty much written by this one guy. And if you've ever seen Reefer Madness, that was the message, that there was this undertone that, watch out, these Mexicans and black jazz musicians high on the reefer are going to come not only, get your kids to smoke and ruin them, but also watch out because they'll rape your white daughters, because marijuana turns men into maniacs and psychotics and axe murderers and rapists.
Right. It's just a continuation of that birth of a nation stuff.
Absolutely. I even see a connection through more modern times to the
Mhm.
so-called gateway theory.
Right.
Because, you know, after so many years of, especially generations of young people hearing that reefer madness stuff and say, yeah, smoking pot's going to make you into a deranged axe murderer killing your family. I don't think so. And then it kind of evolved into, well, okay, maybe it won't. But if you smoke marijuana, you'll do cocaine and heroin, and then you'll be an axe wielding murderer. So it's really the same thing, still kind of ever present.
And there is that kind of that this article does speak to as well. And if I remember correctly, when I read it a couple of weeks ago, if I'm not confusing it with another article, but this particular journalist is married to a psychiatrist, and a lot of what he was referring to is kind of what my wife sees in practice. And one of the impressions I did get is that kind of, oh, classical, I'm an expert because my wife or my father or my mother, you know, somebody I'm related to is in that field. So that makes me an expert by default. So that's always worrisome and problematic. But, you know, I think when we look at all of this stuff, right, more than any particular aspect of what is or isn't, what we know, what we don't know, I think is really about how do we conceptualize of all of this? How do we think of these issues? This article in particular really is just so reactionary. And it really is more that, oh, it's a conspiracy. They're not telling you the truth. I'm going to tell you the real truth, you know, the underlying danger. And as people often do, they will take maybe a single case report or single case study and generalize that to everything, right? The truth about a relationship between cannabis and mental illness on any level is that it's complicated. But I think we have to really parse out the levels that we're going to be thinking about it on and the way we're going to, you know, try to perceive it. We have to look at it in terms of causation, which is a very, very different conversation and a completely different area of thinking than exacerbation.
Right.
What is that relationship between what is already there and the impact that can have, which is also a completely different conceptualization than looking at co-occurrence, which is where we also have to look at that chicken and the egg. So I think what our biggest obstacle in any of these discussions is, first thing we have to do is just calm down, sit down, turn it off, and let's listen and let's look at this as rationally as we can, because it is very nuanced. It's so multidimensional, and there's so much more that we do not know than we can say that we do know. So,
and just repeat those again. It was causation. There was a second one, and then co-occurrence.
Causation, exacerbation,
right,
and co-occurrence.
Okay.
And that middle one, that exacerbation one, is especially relevant when we're talking about adolescence and mental illness, right? Because as we all know, as psychotherapists and psychologically minded people, that conditions like schizophrenia almost always emerge in late adolescence. Yeah. Which is likely the time that young people are discovering drugs, marijuana, alcohol, any consciousness expansion. So there's a very telling line in that article that also ties back to the same old reefer madness idea, that the journalist is saying is reporting all of these psychotics and criminally insane people and murderers that his wife was seeing. He said they all smoked marijuana. This is exactly the premise, the faulty kind of logic that leads to gateway theory. If you poll, you could prove this, quote, scientifically. You survey 10,000 cocaine addicts in treatment and ask them if they ever smoked marijuana before they did cocaine, right? And then don't be shocked when 99+% of them say yes. But it's a flawed conclusion to then say marijuana led them to.
Well, sure.
Ask 10,000 cocaine addicts if they ever drank chocolate milk before they did cocaine. Nobody's going to call chocolate milk a gateway drug.
That's right. That's a much greater correlation.
I think that actually that could be a real concern. I'm concerned now about chocolate milk.
Well, we should, but for different reasons.
Marty Klein has made this point about sex offenders and porn. There's that same the group of people that insist that porn leads to sex crimes, Of course.
Right.
Ask sex criminals if they saw porn before they committed their sex offenses. And again, same faulty conclusion to say the porn use led them to commit these crimes.
Right.
It's
And
pseudoscience.
it's not only their statement of that, but we create these contexts of, again, selectively choosing our own credibilities, right? Marty Klein, also one of our favorite lines with that same issue, is that, you know, if some serial killer said that they were triggered by watching Cosby Show reruns on TV, we would look at them as the sociopaths and psychopaths that they are. But somebody like Ted Bundy and some of these other serial killers say, well, they really got triggered by watching porn. And we do treat that as the words of a social scientist, well thought out and almost intellectually driven.
Right.
It's just
right.
insane.
And this is why I think that this is an important topic to bring to a program like Mormon Mental Health, because there is some type of moral overlay here. I'm not saying, you know, marijuana is no big deal and everybody should go start smoking, or that there aren't any implications about it, but there tends to be with issues that are morally objected upon, especially in religious cultures like my own, the panic around these issues tends to be much higher. And I see my population as being more vulnerable to these types of tactics that can lead to this kind of hysteria and anxiety and kind of incorrect information. I want correct information. I want people to know what the benefits and risks are. And there are benefits and risks to marijuana. But to take it to this level of, like you're saying, hysteria is not helpful. And I feel like my population is more vulnerable to that.
Right. And I think there are some other like significant foundational issues that also helps drive that. And it really is the particular belief about just using drugs to alter consciousness. You know, I mean, there's so many people that just see that just as a concept as inherently wrong. So once you cross that line, you're already, you know, incorrect, as opposed to the understanding that altering consciousness, including through chemical means, really is a natural biological drive. And every living being not only alters consciousness, but certainly the vast majority of animals, from big to small, have chemical means of altering their consciousness. So, you know, the idea of getting high, which is really what altering consciousness is. And if we're going to also be clear about understanding the concept, it doesn't really matter how they're getting there. That's what we're arguing about. Whether you're doing it in church, whether you're doing it on the dance floor, whether you're doing it through exercising, whether you're doing it through meditation, or you're doing it through drugs, you're doing the same thing, just doing it in a different way. Right? Now, chemical means simply have the advantage of being quicker and easier.
But just to piggyback on that point, when we look at brain chemistry, it's all chemical, right? Because all of these activities alter our brain chemistry. When someone is in religious ecstasy, someone is entranced in a good book, or someone is enjoying sexual union, they're high because their brain chemistry is altered. So to your point, yes, drugs are quicker and easier, but you know, Timothy Leary's whole bit in espousing the use of hallucinogens was really just kind of a shortcut to people forget he was attempting to duplicate the altered states of transcendental meditation and Buddhist monks who'd been training and studying for decades to achieve these states of consciousness.
Right. Okay. So going back to some of the points that he's making in this article, how do we start using these three terms that you just used, causation, exacerbation, and co-occurrence, to complicate why there might be bigger numbers of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia who have also experienced marijuana use or who have experienced violent outbreaks? Because he's trying to make some very clear correlates that somehow marijuana is involved in that.
Right. Sure. And it's just really, I think, an arbitrary assertion that many people do make. And this is kind of the point that Ricky, I think, brought up earlier, that especially when we're looking at schizophrenia, when does schizophrenia emerge? That's a really important concept, especially when we're talking about schizophrenia. It emerges during adolescence. people generally start smoking and using cannabis in their adolescence. So I'm not going to disagree generally with the idea that there is some kind of correlation, but it really is that which is first. Did smoking marijuana cause schizophrenia, or was their emerging schizophrenia what drove them to start smoking marijuana?
Right. And then not to mention, I'm guessing, well, the exacerbation piece is that you can take a problem that's already there and then add another kind of fuel to it, and it can make the problem worse. But that doesn't mean that fuel would affect everybody the same way.
Exactly.
Right. It's this. I think it's the idea that the disinhibiting effects of any drug, from alcohol to cannabis and even harder drugs, may exacerbate these outward signs. Right. But I think it's also interesting to note that a handful of schizophrenic patients that I've worked with over the years, almost across the board, have remarked in one form or another that discovering drugs like cannabis or even more potent hallucinogens somehow made sense to click with their thinking, like, oh, now this makes sense. I get it now, right? That there was almost a positive effect, or confirm that they know there's something wrong with their thinking. Or some have even said that smoking cannabis made them feel normal.
Right. So then he's stating that actually, because cannabis or some strains of cannabis can lead to paranoia and things of that nature, that psychotic episodes and then things like homicide, and I mean, it's intense, right? What he's saying. I mean, you're more likely to kill somebody.
Absolutely. And I think if there was an iota of truth in any of that, we would not have any medical cannabis programs in this country or anywhere else in the world. If there was any possibility that any of this could be true, we wouldn't be where we're at with the burgeoning cannabis industry and the medical benefits that are being revealed every day.
And I think that's what's in reaction to. It's a Chicken Little thing. The sky is falling. Beware the danger that is about to rain down upon you. It really is just that hysterical thing. There is no basis in fact or even reality to make that claim that he made.
And I think Colorado is a good a case study, because people have been anticipating all of these all of these horrible outcomes, and nothing seems to be happening yet in Colorado. There aren't packs of drug-crazed marauders in the streets and cities in flames because of the loosening of the legal restriction on cannabis use in the state.
And by the way, if anybody's listening and has questions that they want me to ask, please feel free to post those on the Mormon Mental Health podcast page, and I'll make sure and make sure to ask Larry and Ricky about that. The other thing that, is interesting, he starts off by basically making the cannabis advocacy groups or whatever so powerful, like the lobbying power is so high. And I'm like, since when is the cannabis lobbying power so high? I mean, we've had people in jail for like silly.
Well, if I can correct, the cannabis lobby often they are so high, they're just not that strong.
Right.
I was going to say the lobby didn't get powerful until last year, and when John Boehner decided to jump on that bandwagon. That's not what we would think of as the typical face of a cannabis endorser.
Yeah, and he just makes it seem like there's all this like corrupt like power that the cannabis lobbying has had that keeps all of this information from coming out, and that just.
But that's the reefer madness mentality.
Yeah,
because it's the cabal of cannabists that are secretly trying to take over and steal your children and ruin their lives and get. I mean, it's really such an old story.
Yeah,
we're certainly
almost obsessive about how it gets to continue and remain somehow part of the conversation.
We certainly don't want to come across as saying it's completely benign and harmless and everybody should use it, particularly developing adolescents who are supposed to be developing their cognitive abilities and learning. And Sure, there are some signs that marijuana use can impede learning and memory and recall. But one point, and another point I want to make, one of the giants on whose shoulders we stand is a guy named Andrew Weil, who, while Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, soon came to be known as Baba Ram Das, got much more notoriety and fame doing mushroom and LSD research at Harvard. Andrew Weil was at Cambridge doing some of the first marijuana studies. And he wrote a powerful, powerful book in 1972, I think, called The Natural Mind, which we actually use as a supplemental text in our drug education class because he's just so brilliant and makes so many great points. Even that many years ago, we still haven't caught on to his simple wisdom and how we can get a handle on our so-called drug war. But he makes the point, everyone knows this long-standing reputation, the worst, number one supposed effect of marijuana use, this so-called amotivational syndrome, that smoking marijuana makes the user become unmotivated in life. And he just makes the simple point that why can't we consider that unmotivated people might happen to like smoking weed, right? And that's back to the point of causation.
Right. Yeah. And co-occurrence.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, again, they all kind of, feed into each other. But okay, all right, yes, high level of lazy, regular marijuana use. We really can't say anything about causation there. Because again, are there certain personality types, certain behavior types that will just automatically gravitate toward that? Just like we talk about sensation seekers, why can't we kind of have an equivalent type of characterization of cannabis seekers or something like that?
There is something I think worth pointing out also that I often refer to as the lifestyle factors that go along with it, because we also know it's kind of a cliche to hear, especially, in this kind of hysteria among parents, to describe kids as losing interest in other activities. They used to play sports and play music, and now they don't do that anymore, and they just sit around with their stoner friends smoking weed. I don't think that's the drug as much as the kind of lifestyle changes that often accompany, especially with adolescents who are trying on identities like clothes every month. That their friends change and their musical tastes might change and their recreational activities might change. But to say that marijuana caused them to lose interest in sports and going to church is just hard to conclude.
And again, that another sort of foundational conceptual piece in all of that too is and we've talked before about the irony of how rigidly people speak about brain plasticity. And this idea that yes, with regular use and a lot of these even behavioral patterns as well as chemical use patterns, are there changes in the brain? Absolutely. But the problem with most people's thinking about that is, okay, if those changes, we have the plasticity to make these changes, why do they have to be so convinced that if those changes form, we're stuck? Right? We form new pathways. We can make new changes. That's what it's really about. That's what plasticity is about. So even if we can look at these patterns that may become habitual, may become sort of comfortable, it now becomes their default status. I think we also, especially as clinicians, have to stop thinking that that's an end of a road. And you begin to now define that person for the rest of their life based on that. Right? Let's continue, right? Pave a new road, make a new path. That's really what the brain does. So, this idea of adaptability, right, has to also be looked at in regard to how we're looking at people's use. Because then we can look at even adolescents that get into those patterns and maybe get into that sort of slothish kind of mode. And it goes maybe a little bit longer into their lives. We're talking about behavioral conditioning. We're talking about just, patterns that they have developed regardless of where they are. And then it's about learning new ones if they're motivated. right? If it's not a problem for them and that is sort of their mode of operation, we can't really just inherently judge that as being wrong or problematic.
So just to pick on this article one more time, and then I'm going to move on because there's some other questions I'd like to ask. He refers to the phrase cannabis-induced psychosis. What is that about?
Fiction? No, I mean, basically, again, that's the assertion that, and some of that was based on one case study, one college student, and there's also bipolar psychosis, I think they originally called it. But the assertion that this one guy who started smoking cannabis when he was 16, now sometime at college, he had an experience, he smoked and became psychotic, delusional, well, mostly just delusional. It wasn't any hallucinations. Very, very agitated to the point where he had to go to the hospital. His friends, was worried. They brought him to the hospital. And then they, again, diagnosed him with psychosis. And then there was another occurrence, I think, several months later where it happened to him again.
Well, I mean, we know these are DSM diagnoses. For every drug, there's an associated, blank induced blank. Amphetamine, whatever. They're all listed in there. Every drug has its own category of potential consequences. So yes, this is not a made up thing. There is instances of drug-induced psychoses. But as drug categories go, there's been kind of an evolution. I think more in the 70s, people used to talk about hallucinogens mostly. This idea a lot of us grew up with, 70s babies, that, if you do LSD, you'll think you're Superman and can fly and jump off a roof and kill yourself. And nobody in history ever knew anybody that thought they could fly when they were high on acid and jumped off a roof and killed themselves. But again, if acid exacerbates some present mental illness to disinhibit someone to act out in some psychotic way, there's the interesting question. And then I think it's fair to say maybe it wouldn't have happened if the drug wasn't brought in. So then can we blame, is it the drug effect or is it a brain effect? If you have 200 people take the same dose of the same acid and one of them freaks out and ends up in the psych ward, can we say that's a drug effect or a brain effect? Was it that one brain because the other 249 had a great day? Or is it a true psychosis in that one brain that the acid triggered?
Right. So it's about being idiopathic, not about what any element of the drug.
Right. Because we all have different, if you have somebody who's already clinically depressed or even the schizophrenia, idea, it makes me think these people who are maybe slated to be schizophrenic may also have other issues going on that might make them more susceptible to alcohol use or marijuana use prior to a diagnosis of schizophrenia anyway.
But I think if there was any truth to this, we're right now, all of us in the United States living in a big giant lab with the last 3-4 years with the rapid growth of medical cannabis in more than half of the states. If there was some truth to this, wouldn't we right now be seeing an explosion in schizophrenia diagnoses? Nobody else but this guy seems to be talking about it.
There was a study done in Israel, I believe it was 2013, a guy named Lev Ran, who it's probably the largest epidemiological study on cannabis use. I think it was like 43,000 or 45, 40, something like that, subjects. And basically what they found was that people with mental illness were 7 times more likely to use cannabis than people without.
Wow.
Now, he also basically went on to talk about the incredible number of methodological problems and flaws. They were specifically looking at the rates of cannabis use and abuse among people with psychiatric disorders, but asking them to subjectively describe intensity of their use, intensity of how they're feeling with their mental illness. They did not account for the number or type of psychiatric diagnoses any individual had. So you could have one person with depression, you could have another person with a personality disorder, PTSD, I mean, a whole host of things. Didn't do that, never accounted for potency or really method of use. If somebody smokes a bowl, is that the same of low THC cannabis? Is that the same as somebody who smokes 12 joints of, hydrochronic skunk? Not the same thing. Or somebody that uses edibles or vaporizes. So there was really no way for them to make any kind of conclusion. They followed that up with a large meta-analysis to see if they can parse out, different aspects with depression and cannabis use. And ultimately, what they were able to conclude was that there is no difference in cannabis use rates among people who are depressed or diagnosed with depression or people who have not. And there is no difference in the rates of depression among people who use cannabis and people who don't. So what does that say about cannabis and depression?
Yeah,
this
really.
Is also, we're arriving at the first time in history, and I hope that this research starts at some point in earnest, but really this is the first time, generationally speaking, that people will be able to study since the 60s, since the baby boomers. Now we can find cohorts of people, thousands of people who've been smoking marijuana for 30 plus years and look at, are there long-term effects?
Yeah.
Right, because that's another thing that I was wondering is he talks about all this research and I'm like, hasn't the research been highly stymied by our country anyway? At least our country. I don't know about other countries.
Yeah, well, most other countries too. Israel is really the shining star here.
Can you talk a little bit about this idea of, back in the day that the levels of the intensity of the marijuana were so much lower than what kids are smoking today? That makes a huge difference in the possible implications.
That does. And I think it's fair. I think it's fair to challenge the age-old notion that most of us grew up with, that marijuana is a soft core drug. Particularly for that reason. We've had 30, 40 years of hybridizing and genetic tweaking and engineering that, any old hippies who say, oh, you should see the weed we smoked back in the 60s, need to admit that it sucked. It was a completely different plant than, as Larry was saying, than today's Frankenstein's monster hybridizing genetics of high potency. And especially with young people, that's something that needs to be talked about, that this is not, it's just as dangerous to call alcohol soft core or ecstasy, which is dangerous for a whole other set of reasons as a street drug, because one can just never know what's in it.
Right. And, let's also broaden, that concept for most people, the same way we need to broaden it for, like internet porn. There's a big difference between somebody do it just for porn and look at the whole internet thing. It's not just cannabis. Any kind of drug use, any kind of external substance that somebody is using on a regular basis in early years and in such formative brain development years is going to affect how that brain is developing. So we don't really have to talk about any particular drug. I mean, we could talk about Monster energy drinks and have exactly the same conversation. It's really more about, I think, a better understanding and a context. I've said this to young people, including, my niece and nephews growing up, basic rule of practice. Let your brain finish before you start messing with it.
I like that.
And I like to add, let's, at least get to a point where we have some better grasp, some relationship with reality before we start altering it.
And is that about 25, 26?
Probably, yeah.
Right?
That's developed, ultimately.
Yeah.
Well, again, not saying that people can't use until that point, but again, just we want to keep some of these things sort of in mind in terms of directing our use.
So let's dive into that. I mean, we've kind of said, okay, this is maybe a panic piece, a bit of propaganda, a bit of, taking the research and taking it too far. And you've talked a little bit about it, but what would you say if you had to list the concerns about cannabis use? What are they? What are the potential implications? And then let's also talk about the benefits. So let's kind of give it a fair kind of possibility on both sides, like is usually true with most chemicals.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, an analogy we often use in our drug classes, you know, just to kind of start with that is, you know, to say that drugs are bad is basically like saying, well, just say no to fire. Right? You know, we kind of make a sort of an analogy. You know, is fire the most destructive force in the known universe? Yes. Is it also one of the most beneficial forces in the known universe? So the difference between fire good and fire bad, it's not really fire. It's how we're using it. Right? Yeah. What kind of tool are we allowing it to be? And it's no different for drugs. You know, how are we using it? Drugs have no value. They're not good or bad. Any way value is brought in is based on use. So people can use in ways that are beneficial. People can use in ways that are harmful. Right? So it really is that personal sort of agency when it comes to what are they doing with their drugs. So with cannabis, with the increase in potencies, and again, the idea of it's not a drug anymore, you know, like it used to be. No, it really is. And there are some considerations. I think smoking it and even like vaping, inhaling it that way, probably one of the safer ways because you really cannot overdose. I mean, it's virtually impossible.
Has there ever been a recorded overdose in the history of recorded use of all drugs?
Not via inhalation.
I think you'll find more people dying from water toxicity.
Oh, absolutely.
Cannabis toxicity.
I got news for you. Well, you'll also find people dying from water toxicity while they were suspended in the air, levitating over a pyramid. It really doesn't happen, right? You can run over more unicorns with your car. But when we talk about edibles, that is a different story.
Yeah.
We have seen overdoses. We have seen significant toxicities. I don't think we've seen any deaths. Actually, I know we haven't seen any deaths, but we have seen now that idea of overdose because with edibles, it's much more difficult to control. Right? It's something that really, and I usually recommend for people, you know, edibles aren't the way to go if you want the psychoactive effect. Right? They're good more for the chronic use and
for pain regulation,
chronic pain, inflammation, absolutely. But it's just not a good way to get high. And the problem is, if that's the expectation, then people are going to be impatient. Right? Right. They're not going to wait the hour to 2 hours it may take before any effect may be felt. And in the meantime, you know, half hour later, not feeling it, take some more. Right? Another half hour later, still not feeling it, take some more. And now at this point, before they know it, they could get in trouble. Yeah. So there is a real concern.
These pot tourists who go to Colorado and go, oh, a Reese's cup, let me have, or a lollipop, let me have one of those. Oh, a cheesecake, let me have one of those. And then 4 hours later, they're, you know, paralyzed, growing roots into the couch and crying that they can't see or something like that. But, you know, is that a toxicity? Is that an overdose? I don't think we've seen damage like we see with drugs like stimulants. So let me just finish the point from before, where we grew up with that idea of drug-induced psychosis associated with hallucinogens. What I think we realize now, and I'm glad you brought up the Monster Energy thing, is that abuse of stimulants is much the most likely of all drugs to cause a true drug-induced psychosis. Speed freaks hallucinate. They see DEA agents in the trees outside their 4th-story apartment. They see bugs crawling under their skin. That's a true drug-induced psychosis. And I've never, ever in my entire career heard anything close to that reported with use of marijuana.
Right. Right. And again, and in terms of other things too that people need to be aware of, and of course that, you know, those old commercials that they used to show about, would you want your surgeon going in, you know, smoking a joint before going into surgery? No, of course not. Right. And it's not really, you know, it becomes a red herring, and it becomes just one of those ridiculous ways to try to make their point, and it, you know, they shoot themselves in the foot. But, you know, driving, It's an intoxication, of course. Reaction time is a little bit slower. Right? Now, again, unlike alcohol, they're not going to be dangers for speeding and running people off the road. They may sort of stop in the middle of an intersection, not really realize,
pulled
or
over
just
for doing 17 on the highway.
Right. People don't get violent when they're under the influence of cannabis. So again, while it is not without risks and concerns, it really doesn't even belong in the same category as alcohol and cocaine and heroin and crack and all those things that people refer to as drugs.
Yeah, Natasha, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I'm curious to know how a lot of these folks who are kind of pushing this agenda with cannabis, how you would describe their relationship with alcohol. Is that also?
Well, in Mormonism, and any substance is frowned upon, right? So we're not like pushing alcohol either. However, I do think in general, Mormonism lives within the context of the United States for the most part. And so in general, I don't think that we see alcohol as dangerous, as we do maybe drugs that have been illegalized, right? Like marijuana.
And I think that's making Larry's point from earlier, because we all know alcohol is the most deadly and destructive drug we use next to tobacco.
Right. And I think that's a very interesting point, because, alcohol is legalized everywhere. And we do know that there are problems with it. And people do go to Alcoholics Anonymous and all of that. But it's something we live with, and it's still something that the majority of the population has a somewhat okay relationship with, right? Instead of,
or at least an understanding. Right? But alcohol clearly has a link with disease and destruction of internal organs and shortening of life and increasing risk for a dangerous activity and some of these psychotic episodes we're talking about. The vast majority of cases of violence, especially domestic violence, almost always involves alcohol.
Yeah. And I think we're just accustomed to that. It's really just the legal status that we have been able to accept those things for so long. But, people really understand that. The two, hands down, most destructive substances that people do on a regular basis that will intentionally do harm. I mean, cigarettes are the only thing you can say, if you use them correctly, they'll kill you. Use them as directed, they'll hurt you.
Right. So the two most harmful ones are the ones that we've legalized. And also, and back to the race issue, they're white people's kind of intoxicants.
So there's that systemic conditioning that occurs on many, many levels that allows us to accept those things and not, again, the reefer madness and all of the propaganda-based and driven substances that just didn't have the luxury to be able to be legal. And even though they were, and remember, none of this was the case before like the early 1900s, when cannabis was a widely used medicine, when it was freely available, there was no controversy. It really was, as Ricky was saying before, that again, the immigration that they made. So this his job basically. So he had to create reefer madness, this hysteria, to justify why he should keep his federal position as the first, what we now call a drug czar. Right? So again, there's a lot of that political stuff. Right? When we look at benefits, talk to the VA. One of the most promising areas, hands down, is in treating PTSD. Particularly with the anxieties and the nightmares. Right? I mean, it's been so far, and again, still have to really look into it, but there is enough to show an amazing potential that even the Canadian government, and especially now that it's legal, that the Canadian version of the VA does now include cannabis in their treatment for veterans with PTSD, that they're covering.
That's super interesting.
And we're at a point really where there's so much that what we really need to do is have more research.
Mm-hmm.
We need to do the work. We got to, and that's the biggest, I think, casualty of all of the propaganda and all of this hysteria. It's really preventing some really important research and data from being gathered, and really limiting our understanding for something that can provide great benefit to so many people.
As far as pain, I know another, benefit that seems to come up a lot, especially in the medical arguments, is for pain relief, chronic pain, cancer treatments, things of that nature. And yet, again, in this article, he talks about how it's been shown that in the long run, it actually increases pain or something along those lines. So any thoughts about
to support that?
Yeah. So any thoughts about how that's a benefit and how that can be used as a benefit for what types of chronic issues?
Mm-hmm. Again, we can only sort of give potential for a lot of that, but there's so far in what we've been seeing. And I know, and I've been doing some work with, and we're developing some programs, a very prominent pain. She was a very prominent pain specialist in South Florida, and is now kind of the premier cannabis physicians. And the things that I've seen in her patients and people that I've even talked to, people that were basically pounding like 40 Oxycontins a day, that maybe now with their cannabis and right dosing and the right titrations and the right strains, be able to get this one guy in particular from his 40 oxys a day to maybe 2 a week if he needs them.
Mm-hmm. We also have a close friend who moved from Florida to Colorado because they were the first to legalize, and he's a quadriplegic who suffered a spinal cord injury, and discontinued a dozen prescription meds when he started using cannabis. Wow. No muscle spasm medications, no these nerve drugs, Neurontin and things like this, pain meds. He's benzodiazepines. He's discontinued them all. Mm-hmm. And I think when we look at the pros and cons and the cumulative side effects of a fistful of pharmaceuticals compared to hitting a vape pen, it's really no comparison at all.
Right.
Well, and with the opioid epidemic the way it is in our country and how much attention that's been getting, you would think that this would be kind of a no-brainer. And yet he, in this article, even poo-poos that, like, oh no, it's actually
that it's better for people to be addicted to opiates than to use.
I forget his argument, but it was something like those, as marijuana increases, opioid use has increased. Like,
actually, we've seen, and there is data on this. There are actual numbers to show it's kind of the opposite.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. And so it's fascinating how these, again, like people who talk about research, it just can be so confusing to the public. And that's what just kind of infuriates me about it, right? Because again, I feel like I'm dealing with a vulnerable population who's been told their whole life that anything that's drug related is awful and, basically, comes from Satan himself, kind of an idea, and Utah is right now dealing with this medical cannabis vote that went through. And yet, even though it went through, now they're coming back and I don't understand it completely, and maybe some of the commenters can share a little bit, but it's like the government and it's like church officials in some capacity or another are going to come back and decide how that's going to go forward, not in the way it was voted forward.
So you mean the people voted in favor?
Yes, the people voted in favor.
Politicians are being paternalistic and saying, well, no, we know better.
Yeah, now we're going to come back and it's not like they're totally taking it back, but they're putting forth limitations that were not part of what was actually voted.
Right. They just don't want to do it. Right. So let's see. We have to let's see how we can do it without actually having to do it.
Right. So that's.
Well, I think you and I discussed previously. I think it really was the issue was just kind of forced because you're surrounded now by Utah's surrounded by states where it's legal.
I know, which always reminds me of this cute little cartoon that's like, I'm surrounded. So Utah's surrounded by Colorado.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Oh man, and I just heard of a case where somebody got arrested in Idaho because they're transporting in a truck medical cannabis for one of the states where it's legal.
Right.
Like these are really interesting disaster issues in our country when we have these state rights that conflict.
Right. Well, that's the first thing, the very, very first thing that has to happen, really, before anything else can really move forward, is that we do need to have that legislative change. There needs to be a change in the federal legislation that deschedulizes cannabis, right? You know, even first of all, it should not be scheduled, period. But at the very, very least, get it out of Schedule 1.
Right. Which is the same category in which LSD and heroin and angel dust reside.
Right.
And which the implication is they're all equally dangerous.
Right. And they have no medical potential or research value.
Which is just wrong today.
Right. It's just false. You know, and I think part of the, you know, hysteria and part of all of that too is because, you know, most people, and again, most of the people we're talking about who are this resistance, is automatically equate drug use with addiction. And it's just not there. With cannabis, I will just flat out say you cannot be dependent on cannabis physically. Right? People can create psychological and emotional dependencies on a chair if they want to, but cannabis does not form a physical dependency, and you cannot compare it to heroin and cocaine and crack.
Can you talk about what physical dependency is, just so people understand that a little bit better?
Basically, physical dependency occurs with a pattern of regular use. Your body physiologically it works on conditioning principles. So the more, you know, the number of receptors the person has for that chemical are being stimulated with regular use, they kind of habituate. They get used to that level of stimulation. So then they grow more receptors, which now them being filled brings that response. But with regular use, they become conditioned, they kind of habituate, and now you got to grow more, and they need to be filled in order to get that same effect. At that point, if you stop using the drug, there are withdrawal effects that the person will experience. Now, at that point, when the person stops using and their body begins to cry out to be filled, that's dependency.
Right. And we see this with alcohol and central nervous system depressants like Xanax and Valium and opiates.
Right. And but this is the kind of a difference I want to make, that, you know, if we're looking at it in terms of how the nervous system and these neurochemical systems work, these drugs that you can develop dependencies over, these are basically chemical systems in our bodies that are pretty much reactive systems. They're part of protective systems. They're meant to be very responsive, and they are meant to adapt very quickly to accommodate basically, you know, survival. Cannabinoid receptors are not part of any reactive system. They're part of our homeostatic system. So they're part of our neurological and neurochemical systems that really are about function and foundation. And they're not reactive in the way that these other chemical systems are. And they do not produce dependency because they are not reactive in that way.
Well, and probably some folklore that I had heard is, well, cannabis, marijuana stays in your system longer than maybe other types of drugs. And so the reason why people don't feel the withdrawal symptoms is because it's made 2 or 3 weeks out before the system even rids itself of that, you know, that drug to begin with.
Yeah, no, there's a kernel of truth in that, and it only has to do with the very high fat solubility of THC. That it's, you know, there's always an equilibrium of things sticking to fat or proteins or certain body compartments versus they're being metabolized and eliminated. And because THC is so, I'll say, sticky to fat, its metabolism is very, very slow. But it's conflating to say that because it sticks around in the body a long time, That's why there isn't a withdrawal.
Okay.
Because if someone, hasn't smoked in 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden they're going to start itching and scratching and being sleepless and throwing up like a heroin addict who is physically dependent and sick without their drug, it's a stretch.
Yeah.
But it almost seems there's a built-in selling point to that. Again, not that it is true. I think what Rick was just saying, especially. But let's say even if it was, I would use that. I would market the heck out of that. That's great, because you can see, hey, even if you get to a problem, you have that in you. Just stop using. You will naturally sort of titrate down. You'll never go through withdrawal. There'll never be a problem. Nothing to be afraid of. Use it as you will. Stop using it as you will. It seems like it just is another selling point for cannabis.
Since I've got you guys with, the sexual stuff, any sexual benefits to marijuana? Because I get that question a lot too, as a sexual.
I go back to what you brought up before, that for some people, it's just maybe their own brain chemistry, the way they react to it. For a lot of people, marijuana does cause anxiety and a kind of too much in their head and, self-consciousness, which would make it a really poor choice for a pro-sexual drug. But for many people, the disinhibition, just like with alcohol, the slight distortion in the sense of time and perception makes it indeed a very pro-sexual drug.
Right. And even with that whole
people don't like to admit it, but in the 70s and 80s, a lot of sex therapists would tell their patients before, sensei focus dates, have a glass of wine or smoke a joint. Before the kind of hysteria in the 80s, people used to talk like that, even in our field.
Right. And, I want to say something about that anxiety thing too, because, there are some people that when they do smoke, they do get that, people often call it paranoia. Again, it depends on a lot of factors. It also depends on the different kinds of strains and the balances, sativa versus indica. And it would be probably more sativa type of strains that may cause that, because it has more of an autonomic effect. In a sense, like alcohol, there's both the simultaneously stimulation of aspects of the central nervous system, but also, inhibition of aspects of the central nervous system and stimulation of aspects of the autonomic nervous system. So there is, while not an increase in blood pressure, they may feel an increase in their heart rate. And when people recognize that sensation, it's interpreted as anxiety. And depending on how they feel about that interpretation of anxiety can become an uh-oh and go turbocharged in panic. But it's really kind of the self-induced recognition and interpretation. Now, people can work with people to, mitigate that and understand that. Different strains, different dosages can also help with that. Now, if people may be more naturally tending to separate from themselves, get out of their body, stay so much in their head, then I think there's a larger issue that we want to look at in terms of their sexual and intimate connections, even within themselves. But I think for the most part, there are even neurochemical effects when we look at effects of possibly raising testosterone. There is an estrogenic impact that cannabis has. Women talk about easier arousal, and even if we can now start talking about things like topicals that are starting to become much more popular. They're the only negative effect I have ever heard or read, and Ricky, you kind of hit that. The only negative effect is somebody maybe just being a little too high to function sexually.
Mm-hmm. What about long-term issues with erection or impotence for men? Any links there?
We don't see it.
Never heard of it. Now, again, alcohol is a virtual guarantee. Right. Alcoholics will
also almost a virtual guarantee.
Say again.
What other one, Larry?
Cigarettes are almost also virtual guarantee.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? But no, not cannabis. We have never seen it. Now, again, can we say definitively? No, because we only really have these conversations. We're only starting to ask these questions and starting to look at this stuff now.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is what I really find exciting about focusing on PTSD with a lot of this research, because it's, I mean, certainly far from, the best or necessarily that good, but I think it's one of the best contexts where we can try to see a beginning and an end, where we can try to see something happening at a certain time, irrespective of anything childhood that's there or not. It gives us a better starting point. And I think that in itself is really promising.
Well, this has been like phenomenal. You asked me at the beginning, are we doing this for half an hour, an hour? I'm like, half an hour? Like, hello, I can't talk to you guys for less than an hour.
I cannot believe it's been an hour.
Wow, yeah.
So any closing thoughts as far as just anything I haven't asked about or anything that you want to make sure you want to drive home?
I would say that, and again, especially for clinicians, right? It's your reaction, your response, your belief about cannabis, always has to be secondary. The context of the people that you're talking about, that's where we find the quote normal. That's where we establish the standards and allow that there are, this wide range of safe, responsible, healthy, effective cannabis use. And, it's not an either or proposition. You use it or you don't use it. It's good or it's bad. And if we kind of allow ourselves, especially as clinicians, to see those nuances, our work can be a whole lot better, because we can see how their use might be another tool that we can help them use.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that by saying we still, even with all of this baggage already, I think we're still at the very beginning of our understanding the potential benefit. Even research on our own so-called endocannabinoid systems are naturally occurring chemicals. Cannabis, THC in particular, and dozens of other identified cannabinoids stimulate receptors of an endogenous chemical we have, which has been identified, given the name anandamide.
Actually, there are several chemicals.
The neurotransmitter, but this is of note because it's named for the Sanskrit term for bliss, ananda. Right. So again, like most other exogenous drugs we take from the outside, they're only doing something by working on drug pathways that are already existing.
Right.
So like speed, like opiates, like cannabis, they're enhancing our own natural pharmacy, either positively or negatively.
Yeah.
And our job is to enhance positive.
I'm sorry, I just wanted, because I think people do, as part of that understanding, and I'm so glad that you just said what you said, that it's not just that we have a natural cannabinoid, we have a whole host of endogenous or naturally occurring cannabinoids. When you look what are out there in the plant kingdom, over 568 was a specific number that I saw in terms of these phytocannabinoids that exist in a number of plant chemicals.
Wow.
Our own body have numerous cannabinoid receptors. We have numerous cannabinoids, and they break down and are part of so many other systems that we're really starting to see that cannabinoids might actually be up there with glutamate as among the most pervasive receptor and neurochemical populations in our body. So it's not just this little thing that somebody is doing. This is really a part of who and what we are.
That's fascinating. Well, Mary Fisher says, thanks, guys. I think I've gotten several really good likes on this. And I want to know, yeah, she's awesome. And I want to know, like, what, if people want to know what you guys are about, I know you have training institutes, you have your own podcast, like market yourselves a little bit. Where can people find more of you?
Well, people can see us on Monday nights at 9:00 on Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers, also on Facebook or on the radio in South Florida or on YouTube archives. And you can find out about Modern Sex Therapy Institutes by visiting modernsextherapyinstitutes.com. And you can find out all about the work we do in training psychotherapists and medical professionals in sex therapy and sexuality counseling.
Wonderful. All right. It's been a pleasure. I can't thank you enough. You guys are like invaluable to me when I can call upon you, when I can call upon you to set me
always
straight.
Love being with you.
We're always at your, whenever you need us, we're there.
Oh, that's so nice. And vice versa to you. I know that every now and then I might have some expertise that might be helpful for you. So
and we have so much respect for what you're doing, and so glad that you're out there doing it. So
thanks, you guys. Have a wonderful evening. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,